Welcome back to GridSmart Living. It's been about 2 months since I commissioned the Sol Ark 18K here at my home. Today I'm going to give you the honeymoon phase report. We've lived with it, we've stressed it. Now I'm going to show you if this powerhouse actually lives up to the massive specs on the box. Before we get into the experience, let's look at why this unit is currently the top dog in the hybrid inverter world. We're looking at a continuous AC output of 18,000 watts. That's massive, but for me, the standout is the 200 amp grid pass-through. This allows for a true whole home backup without needing a separate sub panel for critical loads. It supports up to 32 kilowatts of solar input and features a 5 millisecond UPS transfer time, which essentially blink and you miss it. Now for the total specs, let's take a look at everything. So we've got our solar input. Its max supported PV is 32,400 watts. Max usable PV power is 28,800 watts. Total solar input over 40,000 watts combined. It's a significant amount of solar, way more than I've got on my roof. I've really only got about 21 kilowatts of solar on my roof. And in AC terms, because I've got an Enphase system, it's closer to around 18 to 19 kilowatts of actual solar production from my roof. So I'm nowhere near maxing this thing out. Now I don't use the 3 MPPTs. Since I've got Enphase, I've got it hooked up into the gen port of the Sol Ark. So this isn't something that I can currently use. And I would say that 3 MPPTs is kind of low. I was kind of hoping that they would have had around 4. Kind of a minimum, I would say, was 4 that I was looking for. There's actually some out there that have as many as 8 hookups. So 3 is a little light on the MPPTs, but you can make this work. It's just a little bit more challenging. And then let's go ahead and jump over to our AC output. So here's the important part: 18,000 watts of AC continuous power. It's massive. Plus it can surge up to 36,000 watts for 10 seconds. That is a lot of energy. You get your max grid pass through of 200 amps, like I mentioned. Max AC output of 75 amps to your house. So again, we're getting closer to what you would expect on a whole home generator backup system. Typically for those, you talk about 24 to 26 kilowatts of usable energy for a whole home backup. So we're getting a lot closer to that with 75 amps. This is kind of what stood out for me on why I wanted to get the Sol Ark 18K over some of the other options that are out there. Is 75 amps. You can really back up your house and actually run things without the danger of not having enough energy to support things. Now, obviously 75 amps is not 200 amps, so we're not near to the actual 200 amps, but we're a lot closer. Again, most of your standby generators are talking about 100 amps, so about half of your 200 amp service is what they can typically provide for. Really, really close to that. And then if you double and go to 2 Sol Ark 18Ks, that's when we're talking 150 amps. That's going to work for 90% of the people that are out there that are working off of a 200 amp service, which is what I'm currently running on my house. And then you got that backup time of 5 milliseconds, like we mentioned there. Now the Sol Ark is going to be your 48 volt battery, so it's going to work with 48 volt systems. And it's got the capability of pulling 350 amps or charging 350 amps back to those batteries. Now, this is kind of the key. In order to actually make all of this work, you really need to have this for your batteries. So if you don't size your batteries appropriately, you're never going to get these numbers over here. This is all through supported battery. So you are going to have that battery in order to do this. Now, the great thing is that in order to achieve this, you don't have to have this. As long as you've got the battery, you're going to hit this. But you got to make sure that you size your batteries correctly so that you can actually pull 350 amps, not overheat your cables and not have issues for your batteries. You got to make sure that the batteries are going to support this. But as long as you size everything correctly, where you can actually provide this 350 amps of continuous to supply this 18,000 watts or the 75 amps, this is kind of the thing that really stood out for me on one of the things I was looking for, why I got the Sol Ark. And again, it's going to work with your lithium or your lead acids. It's going to support all the typical communication standards. Now for the dimensions, this is a big boy, so this is not something small. It's 137 pounds. I'd say it's a little bit heavier than that, but maybe that's just how it felt to me. But it says 137 pounds. It is outdoor rated, and actually I've got mine installed outdoors, so I can attest to, yes, this is outdoor rated. I have had no issues with it so far being outdoor rated. I've got it on the side of the house that doesn't get a lot of sun, so it's not necessarily in direct sunlight. I'll have to reevaluate that as we get a little closer to the summer, just to make sure that I'm still out of the direct sunlight. But I'm pretty sure that the area that I've got is out of direct sunlight. And the reason why you want that is you want to protect the screen from direct sunlight. You can stack up to 12 of these inverters. That's way more power than you're ever going to need. Again, the typical homeowner with 200 amp servers, you're probably going to be fine with anywhere from 2 to a max of 3, because you're already going to exceed your 200 amps with 3. And then you get your standard warranty of 10 years. And then you've got the MySolArk platform. So that's essentially all the key specs that you're going to be interested in for the Sol Ark. Now this is my system. This is how everything is set up for my house. I've got the Pytes V5 batteries. I've got 8 of them. So I've got a little over 40 kilowatt hours of capacity here. Then I've got my Sol Ark, and I went with the wire way for everything. And then I've got my bypass here. Now if we come over to the other side here, we've got the meter. That comes into the disconnect. The service disconnect is typically required now whenever you're doing any kind of an upgrade on your system. And then this is the solar system. Now I already had my Enphase system installed, so when I did this installation, I didn't have to worry about the Enphase side of this. But everything feeds essentially into this bypass here, and then into the Sol Ark and back to the house. So that's essentially how my system is set up and running. I do plan on expanding my system, adding an additional 8 to 16 Pytes V5 batteries, and then also adding another Sol Ark. And I think that'll get me pretty much to the point where I don't need to worry about anything else. Even when I add an EV to my house, I think I'll still be under the max, as long as I don't turn on the heat strips at the same time for my geothermal system. Now this is the inside of my MySolArk 18K, how I set things up for my install. Now I did actually run 2 sets of battery cables. So essentially on one set, it's going to be 175 amps. On the other set, it's 175 amps, giving me that 350 amp max. Now I don't have a huge distance that I'm going with the cable, so I could have actually done this with a set of 1. But if I expand to another inverter, I wouldn't necessarily need to add more cables for the other inverter. I could actually just do this and then have the 350 amps per run for each inverter. And I'm pretty confident that would work in my setup. But I've always got the option of adding, again, more 4-aught cable and doing this. I actually have all the cable to do this, so I'll probably do it that way just to keep everything at about 175 amps, keep that heat down a little bit in the system. And then again, I've got my solar going into the gen port, as we see here. And then we've got obviously the load and the grid. And then we've got all of our EMP protections added as well as part of the installation. But you can kind of see the setup that I went with for my system with the MySolArk 18K. All right, so what are all the questions people normally ask about the inverters? So how much energy does it draw? And I would say I don't see any real energy usage. It's very minimal. Somewhere between 60 and 100 watts is kind of the constant consumption that the inverter is pulling. So a very minimal draw for the inverter. But based on what I've been seeing, I'd say it's around 60 watts, anywhere to 60 watts to 100 watts is kind of that draw that I'm having with my system here. Now, fan noise is actually incredibly interesting. It's actually quite a bit louder outside than this thing is. So when I go next to the inverter, and I'm trying to listen for sound, I can't hear it because it's actually louder everywhere else in the ambient noise around my neighborhood, where it is so quiet that everything else is just drowning out this. So for the most part, when I listen to the inverter, I can't hear it. And actually, I'm going to show you a video now. You can hear the car. You can hear the car that's coming up, but you can't hear the inverter. I'm telling you, it is incredibly quiet, which is one of the reasons I wanted the MySolArk 18K, is that it is so quiet. And I can attest to that. I will try to get, maybe there's a period in the day where it's a little bit quieter, but on my typical day, you can't hear anything. And if I go out there at night, the ambient noise outside is the same way, where I can hear everything else. I can't really hear the inverter. And it doesn't matter whether I've got the batteries getting charged, or I'm pulling from the batteries, or I'm using a lot of energy inside the house. I can't really stress this thing enough to really make it loud. Now, time of use is interesting. It took me a little while to get the settings, and I'm actually still working on it, because you make some adjustments and then you have to wait a month for your bill to come in to see whether you've had any real impacts. And for where I'm at, we really don't have like your typical time of use where you pay a lot less in the night. We don't really have that here yet, although there's a lot of discussion that maybe they'll be adding that in our area. So this will probably be something that I take a look at in the future. So when I talk about time of use from my perspective, it's really about trying to figure out when to use the battery and when to charge the battery. I'm still working out exactly what is best for my setup, and I'm going to actually show this when we go into the app, and I'm going to show you my settings. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about how this is set up right now, because I'll talk about it here in a few minutes. Now, as far as the install, I'm basically just me here. So I hired a company for the installation. It is a 137-pound unit. It is not light. And yes, you can buy equipment to help you mount stuff on the wall. but it's not something you're going to use all the time. So I kind of saw that as probably not being a worthwhile investment to spend money on that as part of this. So that's where the installation team was really beneficial, mainly for the wire wave, but also for this. Everything else I probably could have done myself and mounted it on the wall. But when there's 2 or 3 people there, why not have an installation team that does everything, especially with some of these heavier things, or in the case of the wireway, not necessarily heavy, but not necessarily easy also to mount up on a wall. All right, so this is the MySolArk app, and this is actually what you see is kind of the landing page when you get into the app. So what we want to do is go ahead and select this here, and then we'll be able to see the specifics about the plant. Now for the plant, we can see basically the setup here that we land on the landing page, and there are some things in here that I am not a huge fan of that I wish that SolArk would change. And I'll talk about those when we get to there. So as we can see here, so far I've produced essentially 44 kilowatt hours of energy using my solar system. And then we can kind of see the total summaries here as well. Now, because my solar is going into the gen port, I don't get the visuals that everybody else would necessarily get as part of this. Let's go ahead and scroll down and we can take a look at this more in depth. Now, when we look at this here, we can see that I am right now from this port, which is actually my gen port or my solar, I'm pulling in about 5,000 watts here. In the system, we identified that this is solar. It would make a lot more sense to me if it was actually showing as solar, not gen. I get it, it's gen, but it's solar. So I tend to think that this would just be a cleaner interface if the SolArk knows it's solar and it would actually just display that it is solar. Granted, if it was solar landed, I might have different information. I think having everything show up where it is supposed to be makes a little bit more sense to me, but that's just a small complaint here. Now we can see for me, it's around 2 o'clock. My batteries are almost up to 95% here. We're providing to the grid and we're providing to the house. So this is one of the few days in February where I expect that I'll probably get to 100% during the day and not need to charge at all before the end of the night. So that's kind of how I've got things set up. And again, I'm going to show you that in the settings here. I try to get up to 100% during the day using solar, but around 5 o'clock, what I do is I actually charge from the grid to try to get it all the way to 100%. Now for January and February, for the most part, there wasn't enough hours in the day and enough sun in the sky. There's too much trees and clouds that were kind of blocking things off. So it's really hard to get anywhere near 90% before 5 o'clock. So from 5 o'clock until I think I've got it set around 10 o'clock, maybe it charges from the grid to fill these up to 100%. And then I use the battery for the rest of the night and into the beginning of the morning. So I'm trying to use the battery as much as possible and charge it based off of the solar. And then we see our consumption here, our export and our charging. So I've used about 12.7 kilowatt hours here. I've exported 8. And then I'm charging a good chunk of my energy is going into the batteries here. And we'll go ahead and scroll down here. This is where I've got a lot of things that I would probably make some changes on. So here is the chart, and this is my first inverter type system. And I have had the Enphase, so I'm familiar with the Enphase app. One thing that is kind of helpful for me or to be aware of when I look at stuff is I don't see color like everybody else. I have a color vision deficiency that affects multiple color ranges, not just the red and the greens, but red and green is by far the worst. But when I look at this, I have a really hard time understanding the chart, like a really hard time understanding the chart. So when I look at this, I can't see when the colors change. When I click on these, I can't see that. Now, obviously I can see that there is a change here, but I have to interpret, did I add or did I remove? So I wrote SolArk and I said, why don't you make these toggles so it's very easy. So it's, filled in like maybe blue when it's yes, and it's not there when it's a no or something. So it's really obvious when this is turned on versus turned off, because I end up having to hit these. And even when I hover over it, it doesn't always show up that I can see what's happening on the chart. So when I click over a grid, for example, I can't really see anything. Now, eventually, if I click over it enough times, I can see the toggle of the color there. So I can see there's something that's happening there. But this for me is incredibly hard to read because of a color deficiency. I can't see colors like everybody else does. So I wish these were actual toggles. So when I click these, like I click on PV, and I don't see any color change of any kind here on this. It looks the exact same to me. I can't tell the difference between them. I can see something's clearly changing on the chart, but it's really takes me a while to kind of figure out what's actually changing when I click these. So that will be kind of my complaint here, is it's not really set up for people with disabilities as far as their perception and their visual acuity. It doesn't really work well for that. And it's an actual disability. Color vision is a disability that's out there. I wouldn't call it one of the more severe issues, but having been a retired Marine where everything was green, red, I can tell you that it was really hard to see charts because every chart was in green and red, and there wasn't any consideration that people couldn't see this. So this is one of those things, since I've retired, I talk a lot about, is trying to include people that can't see those color issues. But I have a really hard time reading this. I just wish that the colors were more obvious, more specific, where I could actually see the difference, or that the toggles at the very least, when you toggle them on and off, it's more of an on-off toggle, or even a checkbox, where a checkbox is where if it's checked, then it's clearly on the chart and not disabled. Something to differentiate these, because it does take me a while to read this chart and understand what I'm seeing. Now, having had the Enphase app, this is one of those things, and that's actually what I compared this to when I talked to Sol Ark, is the Enphase app was very easy to understand. First of all, I think they had toggles, so it was just a very clear and clean way of seeing this was the toggles. And the colors were just more of a contrast. I don't know how to describe it. They were just easier to see for somebody that has trouble with color. Now, because I only had solar and I didn't have battery and I didn't have everything else running in that particular app, I don't know what it looks like when Enphase is the only thing that you have. So if you're tied into just that one type of system, I don't know that it's necessarily easier to see or harder to see. I'm not sure. But I can tell you that this is really hard for me to see, because I can't, other than the battery one, which I can actually see that color and I can see that that's that color. So blues I tend to do pretty well on, as long as it's not shades and it's really obvious. I can usually see those. It's everything else that becomes kind of a challenge. But for the most part, the only thing that when I look at this chart that I can see is battery. Like battery kind of stands out. So that's kind of an issue that people that have color perception issues are probably going to complain about or draw attention to, is this is just not easy to see. Now, the other thing I would call out on this is kind of what I was looking for. And again, I have experience with the Enphase app, but there are some very important metrics that are missing here. For example, how much was imported from the grid? It's not entirely clear looking at this what my import was. How much was produced? How much did my solar produce? I kind of feel like that's missing on here. Is granted it's to the gen port, and maybe that's part of the problem, but again, you tell the Sol Ark that your solar is on your gen port. I kind of feel like it should tell you how much energy you produce. So if I want to answer that question, I go over to the Enphase app and I take a look at it there, because it's still being recorded there, so I can see how much was actually produced as far as solar energy. So I would say that this just should be updated to include more specifics about how much you're actually pulling solar and how much you're actually importing. So really what I think needs to be added here is how much was imported. So what was your grid import? And then how much was your production from your solar panels? And then I think this would be pretty good. Now, I'll also point out that what you get here versus what you get in the mobile app is just different. You don't necessarily get this area here. You'll get this and you'll get some of the other things, but you're not going to get this. And I feel like this is really helpful in the mobile app if you have this information there. All right, let's go back up to the top again. Now, to adjust the settings, what we need to do is go over to our equipment here. And then from there, we go over to the three dots here, and then we can set our parameters. Now in here, there were a couple things that I had to adjust, and for the most part, all I'm really adjusting at this point is the system work mode. So if we come into here, this is kind of confusing and it's not entirely explained well in the manual. I feel like in this app here, we could probably have a couple of like information buttons that explain what some of these things are, or provides an example of, hey, if you're trying to do this, which is a common thing, maybe you're trying to do what I was trying to do, is essentially maximize my solar feeding the batteries during the day, and then charge it for a couple hours just to make sure that it was maximized as soon as the sun was starting to go down, and then run off battery the rest of the day. I think that's a pretty common approach, and I feel like that is really hard to figure out how to set up in this interface. So adding a little information button that says, If you're trying to do that scenario, then this is what you need to adjust to make it look like that, and maybe provide a actual screen capture. That's where I feel like a lot of these kinds of apps miss out. When you're working off of an app like this, where it's a web browser based app, you can add more information to help the users understand what to do. And I feel like in here, that would be very helpful if they had something like that. So how did I set things up? I limited power to the load, and then I set battery first. And then I set up my time of use here. Now for my time of use, I selected basically every single day. And then I want to charge during time slot number 5. And then the installers helped me set up a little bit of this, and I haven't actually adjusted things since. So if we scroll down here, we'll look at time slot 5, and I'm saying from 5 o'clock until 10 o'clock, I wanted to make sure that my batteries are charged. So essentially for the rest of the night, it's going to use the battery to actually run the house. And that's essentially what I was trying to do. Now, these time slots, I can probably start adjusting them as the period gets longer for the day. So as we get a little bit closer to summer, I won't need this at 1700, maybe it'll be 18 or 1900. So these hours will continue to shift. So I'll have to constantly come in here and actually adjust this. Plus, for the most part, once we get to a point in the summer, the batteries will pretty much always be charged. So I could probably come in here and just turn this off entirely so that we don't need to charge at all. The solar will take care of that. Or if I see it's an overcast and a rainy day, I can always come in here and turn this back on, and by just selecting it. So a great example is today. I could probably just turn this off because right now it's around 230 and I'm almost 95%. That's probably sufficient. So I could just unselect this, and then I can come back down here and save. And we can see that command has been sent successfully to the Sol Ark. Now, every once in a while, when you do these updates, it doesn't actually do that. So just come back in here and confirm that your update actually did make a change. So usually what I'll do is I'll refresh the web page about 5 minutes from now and just make sure that it actually shows that change. But again, it does take a little bit of time. So give it about 5 minutes and then just make sure that your changes did save. Otherwise, you'll wake up the next day and take a look at your settings and you'll realize that it didn't save, so it didn't actually do the way that you wanted it to be done for that period of time. Now, if we take a look at time slot 5, what are we trying to say that we're having here? Essentially, we want to provide 18,000 watts and get the battery state of charge all the way up to 100%. Now, because I've only got one inverter, so that's why I've only got the ability for 18,000 watts, but we want to make sure that we're all the way up to 100%. And then if we look at the rest of this, we're going to see that I'm trying to get it all the way down to a 20% state of charge. And I can use the full battery. So I'll pull the full 350 amps from the battery because I'm pulling 18,000 watts. So essentially this page right here is the key page for getting everything set up. Now I haven't actually done the limited to home or the grid selling option here. So I haven't had to turn those on. But as you saw, I am selling back to the grid using the limited power to load here. Now the other thing you want to take a look at if we go back into our settings here is your battery settings. Now on the battery settings, you want to make sure that you actually got your max charge and discharge set at what you want it to be at. Now in my case, I'm using 175 amps per cable run, so I've got 350 amps max. I want to make sure that I've got that set so I can actually pull the full 350 amps. If you set this lower, you'll never be able to provide 75 amps to your house because it's going to cap it out here based on the amount of battery that you're pulling from it. Now, the other thing you might want to take a look at adjusting is your battery shutdown and your battery low. Right now, I've got battery low at 25, and then I've got my battery shutdown at 20%, which is essentially what I've got it set for my time of use also. Now, in there, I've got it set for 20, but it's going to have a battery low indicator at 25 before it ever gets to 20. Now, for my initial setup, the installers didn't fully set everything up in here the way that I would have actually wanted it. So they didn't have it at 350 amps. And then they also had these numbers a little bit higher. I wanted to go a little bit lower than, I think they had it at 30 or 35%. I wanted to be able to go a little bit deeper into the battery. So you have to adjust it here and over there. Now, if I actually wanted to get it down to 20, then I could do this, but you want to set your battery shutdown probably a little bit lower, and you want to be careful about how low you go into your actual battery. If you go really low on your battery, you can actually wear out your batteries faster by doing that. So just keep that in mind. Is the company that built your batteries is going to have some recommended settings, and in my case 25 is within the recommended settings. So I feel pretty confident for Pytes batteries that this is going to work just fine. All right, let's go back to the other page. Now, for the most part, I haven't had to really adjust any of the other settings. I would just say that the system work mode page, I'm not exactly sure what a better design would be, but I think there's probably a better design for how that one's set up. I think the battery setting page is actually pretty intuitive. I've looked at all the other pages. This one I spend most of my time in, and this is the one that took me the longest to kind of figure out what everything is. And even just a simple example of what are we talking about when we actually have these three things. So having information buttons where you push it and a little dialogue pop up and it explains that kind of stuff versus having to go to the manual and try to do the information there. I think little things like that would go a long way with this app, is just adding some of that stuff in here. Like, what does it mean when it says load first versus battery first? Like, what actually changes? I think that's really the issue that I see with this is we have an app that we can use from our web browser, but we're not really taking advantage of the capabilities of a web browser with this app. All right, let's go back to the previous page here. There was one thing I had to adjust in advanced settings, so I'll show you that as well. So I'm on a net metering program, and I wanted to limit how much was going to go to the batteries when I'm charging the batteries from the grid. And initially it was basically maxing the thing out. It was completely putting maximum amount of energy into the batteries, like 12 or 13 kilowatts nonstop, while also doing the house. So I wanted to limit that, and this is where you would set that up, is in here. Now I set the grid peak shaving, that's essentially the setting that you'd want to change here, to 8,000. So at no point will my inverter go over 8,000, which is pretty unlikely that it would ever need to go over 8,000 for anything other than charging the batteries. So I thought that was pretty safe. Now this is something I'll have to continuously evaluate, especially as I add an EV charger or some of the other things, depending on how low the batteries get, those kinds of things. I might have to take a look at this in the future, but 8,000 works pretty good. And I'm actually still waiting for my electric bill to come back so I can see what the impact of this was on my energy bill. Because essentially because of the net metering, it does pay attention to when I pull a lot of energy from the grid. That is one of the metrics that's on there. It's not entirely clear how that's going to impact my bill, so I'm kind of curious to see what it looks like. And it's funny because I made this change during the last billing cycle to make this down to 8,000. And right now my bill is delayed for release by several days at this point. So I'm kind of curious to see if Dominion is having trouble trying to figure out my bill because of some of the changes that I've made on here, or I'm not sure. It's not entirely clear. I've never had a bill get delayed from Dominion, so we're in new territory here. So I'm very curious to see what the problem is or what the holdup is for getting my bill. They're usually pretty consistent. It's probably just a random coincidence. But I don't typically believe in random coincidence. I suspect there's something going on because of some of the changes in the system. But this is really the only thing I changed. And at nights when we're between that 5 to 10 o'clock window, all I see is the grid is maxed out at just under 8,000 watts, pulling most of it into the battery, especially when the battery was only getting to about 50% because there just wasn't a lot of sun time, or the clouds were up there, or snow days, that kind of stuff. So I wanted to make sure that I capped out my grid pull when I was charging that battery. So this might be something you want to take a look at, and this is where you would essentially set that up is right in this mode here. So what's the conclusion? How did everything work out? And I have a geothermal system. I have a heat pump water heater. I've got a heat pump dryer. I've got 2 sub pumps. And then I've got your typical energy usage for a normal house. So I don't have anything kind of crazy. I've got a lot of LED lights. I don't really have a lot of other stuff. We have an exercise room with a treadmill and exercise bike. So I think that stuff tends to use a little bit of energy. But I don't have saunas, and I'm not running an electric pool heater, especially right now in February. So there isn't a lot of craziness on my house. I rarely ever go over 4 kilowatts on a given day. Sometimes there's a little bit of a spike where we'll go up there. My typical most draw right now is when I'm charging the batteries while also using the house. So for my house, we have not seen any issues. The Sol Ark has never turned off on us. We're not off grid, so I don't think we're going to have a lot of the same issues that a lot of people that are off grid might have. But the Sol Ark has basically done everything and worked great for the last couple months that we've had it. Like I said, the only thing I would really change is some of the stuff inside the MySolArk app. And there's probably some other changes that I would make there, but those are the key ones. Again, I'm not 100% sure how I would change one of those pages. I think there's a better way to do it, but I'm not entirely sold on what it is. And it's one of those things where you know it could be better. It's not entirely clear what could be done to make it a little bit more intuitive or easy to do. I tend to think the information on the pages would probably be the biggest impact. It's just making it a little more intuitive for, hey, what does this actually mean? What am I actually changing when I change this setting? I think that kind of stuff would go a long way. And then clearly a little bit better information as far as your usage during the day, how much you're importing, how much your solar is actually producing. Some metrics on the metrics area would be a little bit better. And then obviously all the color issues that I mentioned as well. Those things would go a long way to make that app a little bit better. But overall, I would say everything is great for the Sol Ark experience so far. These are all pretty minor things that I've had great support from Sol Ark. When I have a question, I reach out to them. I tend to think with some of the changes I recommended to the MySolArk app, we'll probably never see those, even though they actually make a lot of sense, especially from just a color perception related issue. There's clearly some things that could be done better there to make it easier for everybody to actually see the information. So we're recording this at the end of February. We'll see if the app ever does change. And if it does, I'll do an update video. But we'll see whether Sol Ark actually takes that input seriously or not and actually makes any changes to make it more viewable by people that can't see colors. Now, if you like this kind of content, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. It really does help the channel grow. Thanks for checking out the video. Until next time.